Hello and welcome to Film Ireland podcast. I have the pleasure of got Tom Burke here, who is publicising his new documentary, Losing Alaska, which is out in intermittent. It's a few places over a few.
It's
weeks.
officially it's out on October 4th. There's a couple of Q&As before that, but really October 4th.
And look out for it in the IFI,
the Lighthouse. It's in the Omni in Rathmines and a couple of other Omnis. It's down in Cork in the Gate Theatre. And I believe it's in the new cinema in Galway as well.
I think it's at Rathmines as well, isn't it?
Rathmines, the Omni in Rathmines.
See,
yeah.
I remembered. So, Tom, I like to get you to tell us what your documentary's about, so I can't be accused of making any mistakes.
In short, the documentary Losing Alaska is about a small village called Newtok, which is on the western coast of Alaska on the Bering Sea. And this village of about 350 Yupik natives is being eroded away by climate change. So the land is falling into the sea year by year. When I first went in 2015, they had about 100 yards or so of land, permafrost land, from the edge of their coastline to the nearest house. And they had seen it retreat by a huge amount before that. And they were saying, we're going to lose houses soon. And I thought, there's 100 yards here. You know, what's the big panic? And in the time that I've been filming, over the 3 or 4 years I've been filming, that 100 yards has disappeared. And indeed, 10 or 15 more yards have gone.
And to go into some specific details, this is like tundra. This is a flat land.
This is
highly exposed to the weather.
This is quite an amazing landscape to visit. So Newtok is on what they call the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So it's between these two enormous rivers, the Yukon, which runs all the way into Canada, and then the Kuskokwim, this huge Alaskan river. And in between those two rivers is this enormous expanse of just flat tundra and incredibly sparsely populated. The village of Newtok itself is 70 miles from Chivak, it's 90 miles from Bethel, it's 40 miles from Tuksuk or Tununuk. So once you're in the village, you know, you're very, very isolated. The only way in, there's no road system in that part of Alaska. The only way in is by light aircraft or a couple of days on a boat. So as a place to film, it was, I suppose you could say, it was an incredible treat. To go there with a camera and to work in that landscape was something else. The land that they're on is supposed to be, it's tundra. It's what we think of as tundra. And it's supposed to be permafrost. Now,
just to explain permafrost to us, I know some listeners will say frost, I get that, but what's a permafrost?
So permafrost, if you imagine an Irish, like a boggy landscape, a kind of a peaty, boggy landscape, which is what it resembles in summertime. In summertime, you feel like you're walking on a kind of a softish bog. But even in summertime, you dig down about 2 feet and you should hit frozen ground. So there's a point at which the land never unfreezes. So roughly the top 2 feet of land will freeze over solid in the winter, and in summertime that top 2 feet will defrost. That's the normal process. What's been happening year on year is that when that thaw period comes in the spring, the thaw or the unfreezing is going down further than 2 feet. So the land is losing some of its integrity. And then winter comes later. Winter is supposed to come late October. Sometimes now they don't have snow on the ground until Christmas. Winter comes later, and then winter is shorter. So that permafrost that's supposed to begin 2 feet down and continue all the way down is less and less permanently frozen, if you'll excuse the pun. And what that means is when the waves come in and hit the exposed part of the coastline, when it was permanently frozen, the land could kind of repel the waves and repel the storms. It's now softer, it's looser, it's wetter. And when the storms come in, and you'll see this in the documentary, the waves are able to undercut the land, and it gets undercut, falls down, that piece gets washed away, and then the cycle begins again.
And the big marker on this exponential damaging change in the environment has been since 1977, I think, isn't it?
Well, they have been...
start recording it.
Yeah, so they have been seeing this go on since the 70s. They started recording it. And it was in the late 90s that they said, okay, if things continue at this rate, we're going to have to move the village. And indeed, things have accelerated since then. They thought they would have a problem, I think by 2030 or by the first third of this century. But here we are in 2019, and they have technically already lost 5 houses worth of ground. So it has moved much more quickly than even they thought.
The likes of Sarah Palin have totally denied anything going wrong, and it seems such an obvious one. But is it just the old same principle as to explain to flat earthers that the earth is round and trying some science on them? Why are they in such denial when it seems so obvious?
Well, so the village themselves are not in denial at all, obviously.
Yeah,
because they can
see the results.
They see it happening every season. Every autumn season is when this happens the most. So they have been lobbying actively since about 96, when they started forming a plan, identifying a new site and beginning the process. It's like anything else, they need funding and they need help. The powers that be in the state of Alaska, it's not so much, denial of climate change that's the problem. It's much more like you've got 350 people who nobody
really cares about.
Now, they can be made to care about them, but, as in terms of their political capital, there are 350 people in a native Alaskan village living a mostly subsistence lifestyle. If they were further south in the area of Bristol Bay and Dutch Harbour, there would be commercial fishing. So they would have...
It would be business.
They'd have some leverage there. If they were further north and even up on what they call the northern slope, there would be oil. There are platinum mines. There are mineral deposits that the tribes often have control of. So they would have leverage there. Where Newtok is, the truth is nobody outside of there really cares about them. So it's been very hard for them to create that kind of political momentum.
It's important to note as well, they do subsist a lot on their own ability to hunt to survive. Give us a bit of colour on the day-to-day existence of these people. I mean, kids go to school, but there's still a very tight environment and not many seem to escape the local community. They're still part of that area for many, many generations. Yeah,
I mean, one of the reasons I kept going back is, in some ways, it's a really, really wonderful place to be. So the negatives are there in the film. There is no sanitation, there's no running water. It's very isolated. It's often very cold. Okay, fine. Once you kind of deal with those things, imagine a village that is almost entirely populated by your close relatives or long-term family friends. It's an incredibly close-knit...
I come from a peninsula like that.
Well, there you go. There's a huge comfort and freedom and warmth that comes from being from a place like that. A total sense of belonging, a total sense of ownership of the place. They also then have this huge amount of freedom, because with all of that isolation comes freedom. There's no police officer in the village. There are no traffic lights. There are very few. The kids in particular have tremendous freedom to just go where they want to go and experience their life on the tundra the way they want to. The connection to food is massively important. And we try and show some of that in the film, that they live off the land month by month, following whatever animal is either moving through or whatever animal is kind of...
And that it's being affected by what's going on with global warming as well.
Not as much as you would think.
Okay.
Actually, that's not so much of a problem where they are. I know further north in the Yukon, they've got problems with the salmon and the water temperature and whatnot. But where they are, the salmon run at a particular month. In the summertime, they go catch salmon. Before that, herrings lay their eggs on the rocks on the beaches nearby. They go and they collect the herring eggs. And then a month after that, they go and catch herring. And then after the salmon, there's the halibut. After the halibut, there's moose, then muskox. And then in the winter, they shoot geese all year round, as far as I know, geese and ducks, tamarins, other birds that we wouldn't have. One of the great things I had great fun discovering, which I think all Dublin people should be aware of, is that seagull eggs are delicious.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know this. And given that we have plenty of seagulls here, I think we should be harvesting their eggs. We went on
cut down on the little buggers.
well, or at least get some food benefit from the fact that we have loads of them.
Hote. It's like a kingdom of seagulls there. So my father used to actually do his own little cull, and he'd remove at least one egg. He wouldn't take them all out because they tend to use all of the residences around Hote as their little kind of what's the word? Rookery, like a rookery, but a little breed, their little nesting grounds. And so we'd had seagull eggs now and again. Yeah.
So what we did, and it didn't. It was a lovely sequence, but it didn't make it into the film because there just wasn't space for it. We went harvesting seagull eggs, and in many nests there would be 6 eggs, and they would take all bar 2, and they would pick them up and turn them around. And if it seemed like the egg had turned into a fetus,
they'd leave it.
So that's that way of life, that genuine connection to the land.
It's a part of their kind of religious beliefs, the sort of animalism, and it's quite a respectful attitude towards hunting, and they're so quite religious about it. Well, not spiritual about it.
You've got the funny thing again for an Irish audience. Did you find that
they're
Catholic?
Yes, I noticed that.
At some point, somebody pitched up in a boat in the late 19th century, I think. You had Christian and Catholic missionaries went up there and converted. It was
quite contagious around that time, I find.
So and they went to some very remote places. So yeah, even Newtok. The Russians had been there. Of course, the Russians controlled Alaska from kind of 1740 onwards. They would have instilled an amount of Christianity via Russian Orthodoxy. And then you had Catholic missionaries after that. But I always think, I never really got into it in the film because it never really seemed much of a part of day-to-day life. But I like that line from The Field from John B. Keane where the priest says, there's only a thin veneer of Christianity painted onto these people. And that actually underneath it's pagan to the core. But what you're saying, it does apply because, notionally they're Catholic, and you'll see there's Sacred Hearts in some of the houses, which for an Irish audience is quite interesting. But nobody really, that wasn't front and centre in anybody's belief system.
And there's no church representation within that.
There is a little church. There is a little church, but I never saw the priest.
Okay.
So he doesn't live there. So again, it didn't seem strong enough to feature in the film. But what Raman says, the way Raman talks about the spirituality of hunting, that stuff goes deep. That stuff is going back generations and generations. How do you think about going after the seal? How do you go about it? How do you do it in a way that's respectful? How do you do it in a way that is not going to decimate the population? They're very... Anytime people would often wander into my... I used to sleep on the floor of the library in the school. And if there was nothing going on, people would randomly come in and talk to me. And usually the talk was always about, what are we hunting next? What's next week? Somebody was always, I'm fixing my boat because next week we're going after this. Or I'm fixing my snow machine because next week we're going after this. The idea of what they're hunting next is always in the front of their mind. So that stuff, that sustainable lifestyle, that balance with the land is real, and not in any kind of idealistic way, in a very, very practical way. If I don't and Raman needed to get a seal that day because he hadn't got one in the 2 weeks before, and they need the seal for all sorts of things, So that side of it's very interesting.
But to go back a bit, what was the impetus for you to say, okay, I'm going to explore this as a documentary? Was it the global warming? Was it the danger of this culture, this village being kind of losing its place and these people being uplifted and moved? Where was the attraction or the interest for you?
I think because this is a Film Ireland conversation, I think I have more freedom. I'm not... Climate change and environmental topics are not at the front of my mind. I didn't think it's time for my climate change film. I've done lots of different types of films on lots of different types of topics. So that wasn't at the front of my mind. I read the stories in The Guardian about the village, and they were good and well written and quite compelling, and they introduced lots of characters. And I thought, primarily, here is a story about a small place. And it's a small place facing a big threat. And I always like microcosms. I think if you're going to try and tell a big story, sometimes you want to do it through the prism of a small situation. So Newtok kind of offered that. It also then, so that's kind of the community element. When you plug in the climate change element, one of the problems I always thought with communicating climate change or films about climate change is what you point a camera at. So even you've got an inconvenient truth, which is very valuable in its own way. It's facts and figures and science, or you've got DiCaprio's Before the Flood and After the Flood. But again, it's hard to visualize some of these abstractions. A 0.5% increase, a 0.5% increase in, or 0.5 degree rather, increase in temperature, or a 0.5 centimeter rise in sea level. You know, those are kind of abstractions. And I think that's one of the challenges of talking about climate change, by the way. So here was a village where it's not really up for debate and it's very easily filmable. You can point a camera at that coastline and over 3 years watch it disappear. That's real. That's not up for discussion.
It's a physical truth.
It's also visual. It's a visual reality. So that's good. And then the third leg of all of that is the tribal dispute. So here you've got a small place. They're being affected by climate change unambiguously. They're trying to move the village. So all these elements are good. And then you find out...
Just to quantify the tribal change for our listeners, that basically there was those who wanted to move and those who wanted to stay, wasn't it? And
at the start, that was the divide, because you had this... you had the new council and the old council. You can imagine any village in Ireland. Mm-hmm. You can imagine that happening. It's not Alaska specific or UPIC specific. It's just human nature. You've got a small place. You've got these fiefdoms. But so again, that was the third element that made me think, okay, there are different layers to the story and there's a bit of depth. Mm-hmm. The tribal dispute is actually quite fundamental, because the traditional council, their point of view is, in Yupik culture, the elders run the village. The elders, by virtue of seniority, they populate this council. We look up to our elders, we respect our elders, and we look to them and their collective earned wisdom, and they'll tell us what to do. So there's plenty of merit in that, and that is the way a lot of these villages have been run for a very long time. And
this was early in your time frame where you spotted all these elements that would make interesting storytelling.
Yeah, so I would have been reading about the place in 2013 and 2014 and making my first inquiries before going there. Mm-hmm. So I'm reaching out to them in 2014. I'm on the phone to them. I'm emailing various people, all of whom are saying, if you come here, we'll talk to you. There's no, if you're thinking of coming here, you should come here. We'd like our story to be told. There's no blockage there. But the old council, so they have that position on tradition and seniority and whatnot. The new council are taking the position that if we're Americans living in the 21st century, surely we should vote for the most competent people, the most capable people to run the village. So
there's kind of new ways coming in, defying the old methodology.
Yeah, it's a modern democratic approach rubbing up against this traditional tribal approach. The village or the film doesn't say one is necessarily right or wrong, but that's a very hard thing to bridge.
One thing I admired about your storytelling is that you presented everything. There was no sense of an agenda there that you wanted us to think one way or another way. You gave everybody's opinion and thoughts and ideas, which is, I think, a skill in documentary that a lot of people don't have, because that's when you veer into pure propaganda.
Yeah.
And you're just pointing someone, look at this. That was that was one reason I really, really enjoyed it. And that's very hard to do, because obviously you have a subjective point of view when you go in. And also you might guard against people because you say, I don't want to see that part of the story. I don't think it's necessary. And I'm sure you did see things like that and a whole other side to the village. I had a brilliant interview with a Australian documentary maker years ago called Dennis O'Rourke. I'm sure you know him. He did The Lady of Bangkok. Oh, yeah. And he did one called Cunnamulla, and it reminded me of your documentary, because he went to Cunnamulla and he was doing a thing on the outback and divisions and divides, and he chose a story a certain way. And he got into an awful trouble with the rich and wealthy people coming over because they were saying, "Are you saying it's a fucking welfare town we have on the outback?" You know, but you can't tell everybody's story.
No.
But so tell me about those difficulties for you as a filmmaker, and also you made friends and you stepped into people's community. You're the the anthropologist who stepped into the environment and goes, "Well, it's not the environment anymore." Tell me about those things. Yeah.
Well, I'll take the compliment first off. So thanks for that.
Well, it very, very much meant.
I think if you're going to make a documentary, if that's really what it's going to be, you can't really have a dog in the fight in terms of whose story you're telling or what way you want it to go. Now, obviously, all these decisions are subjective. Every time I press record, I'm making a subjective decision. Every time I do an edit, I'm making another one. So that's fine. But from my own personal experience, I began the story thinking Stanley Tom was the villain and Tom John was the good guy. And that what we were going to see was that Stanley Tom would be vanquished and Tom John would succeed, ideally, over the 3-year time frame. Now, of course, it's very foolish to have a plan like that in documentary.
You have to speculate. You have to have a sensibility of where it might end up.
Yeah, you by virtue of the funding process, first of all, you have to kind of pitch, here's how I think this will go. Here's what it's about. You know, years ago, people would say when you were pitching a documentary, what's the ending? You know, with a big smile, and you go, I don't know. Give me some money and I'll find out.
Alaska falls into the sea.
Yeah. What do you want the ending to be? Paul Dwan is very good on this. He says, you know, you have to. So the ending is the thing that you have to try to achieve, because there's no ending really. Life goes on. But to get back to your question, I had it in my mind. I had my own preconceived notions. Stanley Tom was this kind of what we'd call a Gombian man. He's kind of the corrupt politician, is he? He was accused of corruption, and actually it was proved that funds were misappropriated. That's what precipitates an election. That's why there's 2 councils. That's why everything gets stuck. So there is evidence and there is a finding against him, much like there are findings against some of our own politicians. So I thought, okay, that's part of it. But actually, as it rolls on, you realize that the bureaucracy, the state and federal bureaucracy that the village is fighting is so thick and so dense and so indifferent at lots of times that actually maybe you need a Stanley Tom.
Which is part of what your ending shows.
Yeah.
That indifference is still huge.
Maybe you need a Stanley Tom character to cut through that. Maybe you need a slightly corrupt character to work those systems, you know? If he is that guy and if Tom John is the more straight ahead, honest guy, maybe it's not clear which guy is better in that situation. So those things are there to be read, I guess.
Again, you got access to these people. It would have been harder for your documentary storytelling if you hadn't got access to all the voices.
So day one, I arrive in the village. Now, bear in mind, but before I go there, because as I say to anybody, students or anybody else,
sorry, who was the first person welcoming you to come along and tell the story?
But this is part of it. I straight away from reading about the divide, I said I can't reach out to one than the other. So I reached into what I consider to be the middle, which is Grant Cashtuck, the school principal. And I asked his advice, and he said both tribal leaders would be happy to talk to you because they both have they want their own story told. So I emailed them almost simultaneously, and I got responses quite quickly. Both of them saying, "Yes, there's a story here. Yes, the village will welcome you." Because my question is, lads, if I fly halfway around the world, am I going to get a door closed in my face? So access is key, always access. So there was emails and then there were some phone calls. The reason there's phone calls is, do you want to fly halfway around the world to talk to somebody who's monosyllabic and isn't going to be a very good communicator? When I got to speak to them on the phone, it was amazing because you can hear in the film that rhythm, that Yupik rhythm that they speak in is is very melodious. It's got its own syntax and it's quite compelling. So once I started speaking to them on the phone, I was like, well, I definitely have to go. Day one, I land in the village after 36 hours of flying, and I'm greeted at the little airstrip by Tom John, leader of the new council. Now this wasn't arranged. He just showed up because he's a nice man. He said, I thought somebody should welcome you to Newtok. Oh, okay, great, thanks. And I'm jet lagged, and I'm not in good shape at that point. So I get in the back of his sled, which is connected to his snow machine. It's March. It's minus 35 degrees. He drives me from the airstrip, which is about 600-700 yards, down to the school, and introduces me to Grant, and they show me where I'm going to be staying, and that's fine. So now I've met Tom John and I've met Grant. And actually in that process I meet Raman somehow on day one. Mm-hmm. And Raman proves to be very important. Once I get my stuff settled, I'm like, right, I've met Grant and I've met Tom John. I need to go and meet Stanley Tom. So I find out where his house is. I walk down to it and he's sitting there watching. I'll never forget, he's watching Bering Sea Gold on Discovery Channel at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And I come in, I say hello. I say, I'm Tom Burke. We've been speaking. And he says, Tom Burke, you're working with the new council and you can get out of my house. So I'm like, oh, Christ.
So you weren't a novelty over there as an Irishman, no?
No, well, he doesn't. You wouldn't. It'd be hard to impress Stanley Tom. He's very worldly and he's very clever. And he basically said, you were seen in Tom John's sled. You're working with them. You've come here to work with them. Get out of my house. And
you had numerous conversations with this man before.
Oh yeah,
before all this.
Oh yeah. And whatever it was, probably the combination of the jet lag and the tiredness and the smelly clothes and everything else. So he pretty much shouted that at me, and so I shouted back at him that what kind of an idiot did he think I was to fly halfway around the world to only talk to one side of the story. So I don't remember what I said, but I just laid into him.
You impressed him
for a couple of minutes. I told him he was a fucking idiot, or that I would
That'll work sometimes,
or that I would be an idiot to do that. And why would I do that? To think about it. And he thought about it, and he went and was probably happy that I stood up to him. And then he said, "Okay, we'll do an interview tomorrow." And that was the start of that.
That was a good start. So tell me, you spent 4 years, including your editing and your prep. How many visits did you make to Alaska when you were shooting?
It was 7 visits in total over the 3.5 years of filming. So 7 visits, and each visit was between 2 and 3 weeks.
Okay.
Now the reason the visits were so long
Did you try and make sure there were different times a year?
Yes, yeah. So all of that was, and that's massively important because my first trip was in March and everything is totally frozen solid, and they live a certain way in the winter.
Yeah.
So they move around on snow machines and 4-wheelers in the winter. There's no water visible. Everything is frozen solid, and they're ice fishing, and they're hunting for large game, the moose and the muskox. And that's what's going on. In summertime, it's like a completely different place. It's much more like the Everglades or something. There's water and swamp everywhere.
There's not so much of the summertime, but you have it in there, and it is amazingly the difference in the area. Did you were guiding, using the structure of the conflict as a guide for how you were going to approach the filming, or did you have a few more ways into your material that you knew that if something else changed, that you were going to go a different way? What way were you thinking when you were at that point where you'd built up a momentum?
I think the conflict was something I thought I would follow as it played out. I figured it would resolve itself at some point, and indeed it did, which you'll see in the film.
Yeah, and not the way you expect either. I suppose you could argue that there was certain things that happened. We won't give away the entire film, but there's an interesting turn in there, all right.
Yeah, and obviously you can't plan.
Yeah, and that would not have been something that you were thinking about.
No,
for any stretch, and it also led to another question or discussion about what it means for these people to live there, because the thing that always cracks my head is like these people are in an amazingly tough environment to begin with, and then to find out, wow, my tough environment has fallen away from me. So that's like unbelievable.
But they are tough.
Oh yeah, I don't
tough environment,
it.
but they are tough. So the tribal conflict was kind of one thread. The effort to relocate the village is another thread. But in a way, they're kind of their background or their context, what you get into or what I got into then is what's it like to live there? So what's Raman's daily life? What's Bosco's daily life?
Tell us a bit about Raman, by the way, because he's a key figure in there and he doesn't really fill either of the agendas in a political way. Would you agree? He's more of the soul of the piece, I would describe him.
Raman is an amazing communicator and a thinker. He's a very much a creature of the tundra. You could put Raman down anywhere on that landscape and he would know what to do.
You couldn't imagine him outside that environment ever.
He's been outside that environment. He went to college. He went to university in Fairbanks for 2 years. I think he lived in Anchorage for a while. But he is living and breathing all of these Yupik traditions, and when it's working for him, it's working really well. He has a poetic way of speaking. So he represents, and he's not alone in that. He was very representative of kind of a group of people in the village who were living their sustainable lifestyle in a very real way, and not in any kind of a superficial way. As I say, that stuff, goes really deep with them. So Raman kind of fulfills that role in the film. Harold, the story of Harold is different because Raman is feeling the pressure of, am I able to live in this place? It's costing me certain things to live in this place. Do I want to move to the city and have a real job and have a car and all of that? Or do I want to live this traditional lifestyle that is difficult and somewhat dangerous, but really, really fulfilling? Harold is on the other side of that, where he's thinking, I've got all these kids. It's too difficult here. It's just too difficult. There isn't a house for them. The kids are getting sick because there's sewage everywhere. So Harold moves to the city and realizes what he's lost, So getting into the bigger issues are kind of the context in a way, and then getting into the smaller human stories, I think, is where it comes alive.
So when you arrived there, the camera was quickly pulled out for interviews and that. How quickly did you get to know the community and find where you were relaxed to turn the camera on them, that you'd done the proper work and the handshakes? And what were they like dealing with that? Not intrusion. Someone might enjoy it. Were people more guarded in the 21st century to cameras than they would have been 50 years ago, I think? Would they like that, or were they interested?
It's funny. I think what you're saying is true, but it cuts both ways. You've got some people who are more guarded because they know what a camera is and what it can do, and you've got some people then. The way the internet is now, anyone below a certain age is completely unfazed by the camera. So actually, there was only a couple of people whose reaction to the camera was problematic. Younger people, it was as natural as talking, and older people, they were just naturally unguarded. So I didn't have that many problems in that regard. But I will say this, on the first trip, because it was so far and because it cost so much to do that first trip, I was fairly mercenary about getting as much material as I possibly could. So I did an awful lot of interviews, way more than I used. And I filmed all the time. I filmed as much as I possibly could. So I was there for 12 days in total, because I thought, I don't know when I'll get to come back here. So I need to get as much of this in the can as I possibly can. How
much were you thinking about your stylistic sensibilities?
Oh, I'll come back to that because that all relates to the temperatures.
I was going to say
the first trip,
the technical thing was the next question.
There were limits. There's limits to what you can do. So I was very mercenary. I think I filmed more than I would have under normal circumstances. What happened then was they're used to people coming in. They were used to news crews coming in, doing a piece for a day, day and a half, and then going. So straight away, I'm in for 10, 12 days. And they're like, oh, okay, the Irish guy is still here. Okay, so that yielded a certain response. At the end of the first trip, I said, I'll be back in the summer. And they went, yeah, right. Okay. So then when I showed up in July, a few months later, they're like, oh.
They remembered you.
Oh, the Irish guy's back. Okay. Okay, fine. So again, more conversations, more deepening of the relationships. And at the end of that trip, I said, I'll be back in the spring. Yeah, yeah, right. The Irish guy has enough now. And when I showed up the following April, that's when everybody really, I'm thinking Raman, Bosco, Grant, and Harold, they were like, okay, this guy's for real. And that's when the doors really started opening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the doors opened and I started using the camera less because they were inviting me in for tea, they were inviting me in for dinner, things that I didn't necessarily want to film, but they were telling me everything.
The guys have seen the documentary?
Yeah.
And did you go to them?
I flew to the village. That was trip 7, where I flew over without a camera and showed the film to the whole village. So we projected it on the wall of the gym, on the whole, well,
in the school.
Yep. So half the village came out on the first night, and then I got stuck because of the weather. I got snowed in for 5 days, so we just kept showing it.
Oh, really?
And people just kept coming. So the village, I can say, because I did the work of going there and showing it to them, with only 1 or 2 exceptions, the village are very happy with the film, and the village, the main characters and the people in it have said to me, that's us. We recognize ourselves, which is, I think, as a documentary maker, I think that's a massively important part of the process.
Yeah,
to be able to do that. Now it's a bit of a luxury to do that, but I think it's
earned. I think you put so much of your life into this.
Yeah, I don't want to be I don't want to be back here in Dublin scratching my head wondering if Raman is happy.
Yeah.
With the final product. I need to know that he's happy, and lots of other people.
And at what point do you think they understood what you were trying to do?
I don't know if Raman has said this to me, so this might be a bit of a leap, but I think they thought I was just making a film about the erosion. A lot of them did.
Yeah.
Because Tom was filming the erosion again.
And it's a strong part of the marketing, and I think it's good to make sure people know this is not just about the environment, it's about other things. It's about a culture, and it's about people trying to survive in a changing world. So I think, and talk about, your microcosm symbolising the entire fucking planet. It is there.
Hopefully it can be read that way. I think what Raman and Bosco and Harold as well were happy with is that actually it was about the culture. It was about the lifestyle. It was about those challenges of, do I try and make my life in this village, or do I go to the city? So it did speak to all of those concerns, separate from just being a factual story about erosion. So it starts that way. But getting into their lives, I don't think Raman thought it would get into his life so much. And I don't think he thought, because we had very freewheeling conversations about dreams and stories from grandparents and all that. And he was really, really happy that stuff made it in. And I'm like, well, that's actually the most interesting. That's the most interesting thing.
Yeah, you know? Which again, now that brings back to how much of yourself do you feel that you kept giving to the documentary in order to get those voices? There's a certain handshake and a respect between you and your subject matter that would have gained that trust and that kind of conversation to begin with, which in effect reflects you as a filmmaker. I'm probably not far enough away from it yet to know that. I do know that one of the things I do is I frequently work without the camera. I'll either be drinking cups of tea, a huge part of the process,
in the house, and just hanging out and just listening to things and just hearing the language and trying to understand the references, so that when it is time to roll the camera, you've got that kind of soft research done. Another thing I would do is, especially after the first 2 trips, so on trip 3, I would schedule a day of things. I'd be like, right, I'll interview this person, and then I'm going to go hunting with this person, and then somebody else is repairing their snow machine. So I'd have 3 appointments for myself, which are all quite loose. And so I'd film quite intensely for a day, and then the next day I would only go out with a sound recorder, and I would just wander around.
Yeah,
and you would fall into situations.
A very underrated device for some young documentary makers, I think. They don't really appreciate what that does.
It's so I would have a dual function whereby it would give me time to think. It would remove the pressure of having to film or achieve a load of footage. I would just record the sounds of airplanes. I would record the sounds of dogs. I'd record the sound of wind on the tundra, which I spent a lot of time doing because it was hard to get it right. But you're walking around with a microphone, and people randomly walk up to you then, and you start having these conversations. Now, maybe you don't record them, maybe you do, and that opens up different avenues. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those audio elements then feed into the film, because not everything is a talking head. You can use a lot of those voices in voiceover.
Discuss some of the technical problems you had. I mean, as you said, the -35 cameras do tend to get a bit upset when you take them out in very cold temperatures.
Yes.
Lenses start to get damaged.
Yes.
What were you filming on?
I was filming on a Sony F3.
Okay.
So,
tough piece of kit.
More than up to the task.
Yeah, a little ad for Sony. If Sony want to sponsor us, please do. F3 is fucking great.
Like, it's not as some of your listeners will know, it's not a new camera.
No, we see a lot of new cameras aren't as good as some of the old cameras.
This thing is a brick, and it has been through the wars with me. I think that one is from 2011 or 2012. So right. It's a 1080p. It's a 2K camera, effectively. That's all you need. It never missed. It never missed once. All the way down. We got to -40 one day, and that camera was spot on.
Were you doing it in the guard, like where you'd pack it and wrap it in blankets and stuff like that? Were you doing any of that madness? No. Just keeping it in the bag, careful, and
just being careful with it.
That's amazing.
So what would happen is you'd have your usual problem with lenses fogging up when you're going from warm to cold. So fine, you deal with that. The F3 never missed a beat. It was connected to an Odyssey 7Q Plus recorder. It was fantastic. It even has a little temperature readout on it. So I'd be like, oh crap, it's -39. So that would tell you what the temperature was. The tripod head, the fluid in the tripod head froze.
Okay.
Every day.
And how would you deal with that?
Well, actually, the effect of that was the head became rigid, but it became smooth.
Okay, so it was actually useful.
It was really useful. So there's a couple of really slow pans in the film, and they were only possible because the tripod head is totally frozen. So, you know.
There's a little tip out to you guys out there.
Yeah, just freeze your tripod head. But the piece of technology that failed most frequently was my feet. So what would happen is, especially on that first trip when it was very, very cold.
Oh, you learned, did you?
I would start to get a burning sensation in my feet. And I go, oh, that doesn't feel good. And we'd go inside and then you'd feel better. And then you'd go out again after an hour. And so around about the 40-45 minute mark in that temperature, my hands were okay. I had good gloves. I had a very particular coat.
You would have had super boots on at that stage, no?
The boots, I think, was the weak part of my kit, because I had a very good jacket, and I had a hat and all of that. There's good footage of me with icicles on my beard. I sent messages home to the kids, and they're like, "Is Daddy at the North Pole?
Is Daddy Santa Claus?"
Daddy looked like Santa Claus at one point. But the toes and then the feet would start to burn, and it would get painful.
Yeah.
And I'd go inside, and after 2 days of that, I said to Raman, I was like, I'm feeling good, but like this thing is happening with my feet. And he's like, "That's the beginning of frostbite, man." So that's what frostbite feels when it's starting.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. It's like chilblains, but no, it's.
Yeah, so I had to be very careful.
So you're okay with the second trip then? You had the boots on there.
Second trip was warmer. I don't think it ever got that cold again. Maybe down to -20, but actually -20 is not a problem.
It's interesting, isn't it?
When you've been to -40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sound-wise, you were saying earlier that you'd get some local help with your sound equipment.
Yeah, so...
The sound people don't like to hear things like that.
No, but, I couldn't afford... I had great plans early on. There were lots of different ways you could have financed the film and structured the film. In one iteration, I was going to go there and I was going to live there for 3 months or more, and bring crew specifically, and try and cast the right people into that role who could live there for 3 months. It didn't work out that way. Mostly, the financing, as usual, never arrives exactly when you think it's going to arrive. So you make your plans based on that. What I did was I would hire an assistant in the village. I think there was Kevin Charles did it a couple of times, and I think Bosco did it once, and then somebody else. And really, that had a dual function. One, I definitely needed somebody to hold the boom. Everything had to be boomed because
sounds great.
There's two, Brendan Rahel and Steve Flanagan cleaned up all the mistakes.
I know, with post production, great,
and did a great job. But everything was on the boom, and a pretty good boom, because you could have no radio mics in the village because there's a mobile phone mast in the middle of the village.
Okay,
and so you have constant. None of the signals on the radios would work, so everything's on a boom. Therefore, I needed somebody usually to hold the boom, and that just meant
that also Zoom recorder as well for bringing around with you. Was that what you were using there?
Yeah. So on the days when I wasn't filming, I'd have a Zoom and the boom mic myself, and I would just wander around.
Did you film on any other cameras or just stick to that Sony?
I didn't, but I commissioned an incredible cameraman called Daniel Zatz, who was the aerial cinematographer.
Oh yeah, of course, yes.
So at some point at the end of year one, because of course you fly in and fly out of the village, so you're always having these views of it from above. And I thought, okay, well, I need some kind of aerial photography. And one of the things that you notice when you come in on the plane, there was one day, I think it was the second trip, the cloud cover was such that we came in quite high. So we came in above 10,000 feet, which is quite unusual. And when you were at that altitude, you can really see where the village is situated on that huge curve of the estuary. And I thought, I need to get that. And you won't get that with a drone. And I thought, okay, there have been great BBC things and great wildlife things, Discovery and whatnot, done in Alaska. There must be somebody here serving that market.
Yeah.
There must be somebody. And I found him, and his name is Daniel Zatz. And he shoots any aerial stuff for the BBC in Alaska. He does a huge amount of work at the highest level. So I reached out to him, and he came on board quite early on. And he did a trip. His first trip, I think, was in the spring of 2016, just as the ice was breaking up. So it's an interesting time, because what it means is,
because it's an epic to see how fragile that little village looks in the midst of that tundra.
Yeah. So that vision that I described at the start, where you're like, here's a tiny village and there's nothing. There's like nothing for miles and miles and miles in any direction. I needed that captured, better than me sticking my phone out the window of a plane. I wanted cinematic. I wanted the best possible quality I could possibly get. And so Daniel Zatz comes along with not a drone, but a helicopter. And I think it's a Red Dragon with an incredible piece of Canon glass on the front of it. I won't remember the details of it now, but it's like a 50 to 100.
Yeah.
So
was there worry about matching footage there? It looked,
no,
it looked perfect.
No, it's fine. Like and again though, you'd put that down to everything I shot was shot in S-Log in quite a flat color profile. Daniel Zatz did something quite similar, and then you've got Dave Hughes, the colorist in Wimble Lane, and he does that, and nobody does that better than him. But what Daniel Zatz brings to it is that cinematic kind of sweep of here is this village and here is all of that emptiness.
And here's nature.
Yeah. So that's an important part of the puzzle, I think. And again, like with anybody else, you don't want to overuse that stuff. You want to use it for context, which I hope I did. The fun story, the opening shot of the early opening shot of the film that has Raman flying down the runway on the four-wheeler, that was shot from the helicopter about 20 feet off the ground, flying backwards.
Oh, wow.
Because I described what I wanted, because I had pictured this. I had a shot list for Daniel before he came. I said, I want this guy on the runway, but the village has to be behind him.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, right. So the way it was oriented.
Well, that's our introduction to the environment.
That's him bringing us into the village. So it's important. And so Daniel is operating the camera, and his pilot is called John, this incredibly solid veteran of God knows what. So we're like, okay, but the camera was mounted on the alternate ski. And he said, if we shoot this way with the quad going that way, we can't do it because we're shooting across the other ski. So that'll be in the shot. Daniel said, and John said, we could do it backwards. And I said, is that a joke or can you do it backwards? He said, sure, let's have a go. So we flew backwards at 50 miles an hour.
No bother at all.
That guy was, you'd want that guy doing your heart surgery. That guy was unflappable, completely unflappable. So that was a hell of an experience. And then getting up to 10,000 feet. I wouldn't be great with heights now myself.
Yeah. So did you let him go and do stuff like second unit?
Yeah. So what he did for me then, he spent a couple of days with me in the village where we had various things set up. And then I had asked him to shoot stuff on his way there and on his way out, with particular things in mind. Mm-hmm. And that forms the basis of one of what we'll just call the Tom John sequence. Just that, again, getting that big emptiness. Because again, I was always thinking, this is for the cinema screen.
Yes. And that's a huge thing for your head to begin with, is thinking about it as a cinematic documentary, not a television documentary. Would you say that affected a lot of way you thought about it?
Yeah, it did. So from day one, from the first trip, the main difference, because I've done an amount of television and I've done loads and loads of promos and corporates and all sorts of things, and you're used to the kind of the immediacy of what that looks like and how you have to frame things.
Well, there's a particular style you went with as well with your interviews. There's always that little slight profile.
Yeah.
And that was a definite choice that has an effect on how you look at the people talking and the way you don't use the environment in a huge way. Like, we're not concerned with where they are exactly when they're talking.
Yeah.
Because the voice is almost a kind of omnipotent kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was trying to challenge myself to do something different. And again, so that there was two ways of doing that. One was, I have a very nice 20mm Nikon lens, it's a 20mm 2.8, and it's a lovely lens in that it's sharp when it needs to be sharp, but it does depth very nicely. So if somebody is within 5 or 6 feet, you can actually isolate them and have this very nice perspective. Most of the film is shot on that 20mm lens. Some interviews are shot in a 50, and some of the stuff of planes and of animals are on a 180, I think. So almost all of the film is shot on those three lenses. The other thing that was different was, I'm like, this is quite practical, but sometimes this is how it works. The screen, rather than using the viewfinder, which is relatively small, I was using the screen of this Odyssey, which is actually quite big. And so from day one, I was like, right, you're composing shots for a cinema screen. So that bigger viewfinder, if you like, plus the 20mm lens, I kept telling myself to come back, to go
Yeah,
wider.
and you could have done that with a viewfinder. You'd lose sight of track of what kind of composition you were
I think
getting.
it's harder. I do think it's harder. I remember being at a talk with Walter Murch during this period, and he said when he was editing The English Patient, which was, he would have been editing digitally.
That was when, I think, was that his second, or was that his first project on digitally, was it?
It might have been his first.
Yeah, I think
if it wasn't his first, it was his second, but it was an early digital project. And frequently, he's working on a monitor, so he's not looking at film, he's looking at digital imagery. And what he did, he put a little action figure.
I was either cardboard cutouts or an action figure to give a sense of perspective of what it'd be like with someone sitting in the audience in the cinema.
And so I heard that, must have been before I went. And I thought, okay, I have to think in those terms. So when I'm looking at this,
he's probably also the first man to edit digitally standing up.
Yeah,
because he comes from the world of Steenbecks. Yeah, and he just didn't understand, why would you want to sit down editing? I'm busy here.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
Oh, but, fantastic!
But that little note about you put the little person beside the screen to remind yourself that this is not TV. This is not for the small screen. It's going to be 50 feet.
And it was effective for you, that little trick, yeah?
Yeah, because then anytime I looked at the viewfinder, I would catch myself and I would say, how's this going to look big? Is this is there too much of a face here? If we're going to show something, show people head to toe, show context, you're allowed to go wider and have more information in the frame. Or then also you're allowed to be just willfully aesthetic sometimes, because sometimes in the cinema, and this then plays into the edit as well, when you have people in a cinema, you have them.
It's very true.
You can let things run. You can let things breathe. A wide shot might sustain itself for 10 seconds because people get to look around. They get to look from side to side of the screen. Whereas with corporate work or TV work, you're dealing with diminishing attention spans. And you're dealing with the phone. You're dealing with the cup of tea, the toilet.
And the information to be fast and hard.
Yeah. So, I'm not the first person to say this, but to recognize that difference, because I edit my own stuff, to recognize that difference in pacing early on meant I rolled for longer on stuff. I let things breathe more. I panned more slowly. A, because of the frozen tripod head, but B, because I thought I can let let it breathe. One of my, and again, this would be for the film nerds, one of my favorite little cuts in the film is just that there's a pan from right to left of the frozen village, and then there's another pan from left to right of the same spot from a different angle. It's a cut that doesn't really make sense.
But remember,
it's just for me. It's a little break. It's a little pace break to say, let's just exhale. We've just received lots of information. I'm going to effectively do the same shot twice, and let's just pause because we're about to receive a different part of the narrative.
So you must obviously enjoyed the fact that this is essentially your debut documentary feature, isn't it?
Arguably, it is
for cinema anyway. We'll say.
Yeah, I made the documentary. Myself and Shane Hogan did about the Liberties. Was kind of received as a feature doc. Okay. Technically, it was a collection of shorts, but we put it together as a feature.
Anthology.
Yeah.
But, so let's talk about the music. It's a beautiful
let's do that.
Score. Again, it's a big deal when you introduce music into something like this.
Anybody listening to the podcast should hire Gerry Horan immediately.
Yes, I would love to do it all myself. I tell you, he did an amazing job.
So Gerry is incredible, and the relationship with Gerry is among the most important, if not the most important, creative relationship in this film and in several other films. So in terms of process, when I come back from shooting, after each trip, the first sequence that I cut is called For Gerry. So I'll usually talk to him before I go. Mm-hmm. And certainly I would have talked to him. I would have sent him the proposal and sent him ideas early on. And I say, I'm going to this place in Alaska. Here's what I think it's about. I don't know what the place sounds like yet. I don't have a notion of it yet, but here's where my head's at. So I come back, and when I am starting to process the material and start to look at it and figure it out, anything I like, if I start to build a sequence, that sequence is called For Gerry. And then I send that to Gerry, and then I go and talk to Gerry, because I want him to start thinking about music early on. So one of the reasons that I think the score that he did is so strong is that he has also had those 3 years to think about this and develop this. So he's been after each trip, he gets a new bank of footage. We have further conversations. We talk about the tone of the place, what we want to achieve, what we don't want to achieve, what are the pitfalls. Can we plug in any of the sounds that come naturally from the village, whether it's the folk music or landscape sounds? How are we achieving scale of those huge big landscapes, and how are we also achieving intimacy of individual stories? So yeah, the music is massively important. Couldn't be more important.
Beautiful score. Quite judicial use as well, because it's used very sparingly. And when it comes to it really does kind of hit you kind of hard.
Well, I'm glad you think that. I haven't heard anybody. I don't know how much I've talked about the score so far. I had the film in Italy a couple of months ago, and there was a lot of talk about that. But the chat there was, shouldn't it be more Yupik music in the score? And that wasn't a way we chose to go, because
do they know their Yupik music to be making that suggestion?
No, I can't imagine. I can't imagine they do.
Because there is a little nod to the Yupik tradition with their kind of their dance.
Yeah,
and I'm sure they've been interested, but there was something quite evocative about it, without falling into any kind of cliches or dramaticness, if you get me.
I guess
there's like melancholy in it.
Yeah, I guess the music is great on its own merit, and I would like to think that if it works, it's because of how we're using it. So we're not necessarily using it to make the audience feel any particular way at any particular moment. We're sometimes using it for pace.
Yeah.
We're using it to inject pace into things. We're using it to transition. We are using it to kind of elevate. One of the things that Gerry did in the first thing we did together, which was the Liberties, you would take quite ordinary footage. There was a sequence of the butchers loading sections of meat out of a truck and throwing them into their butcher shop. And it was a very factual sequence. But when we put Gerry's score under it, all of a sudden it became epic. It became like, this is some Herculean task that these lads are undertaking, and it's important. And that's where, to go back to the kind of anthropological side of things, the music, I think, can help reinforce this idea that this very ordinary stuff, this very ordinary life, is important and it has value. Mm-hmm. So Raman is just one guy living in a small village on the edge of the Bering Sea. But when you pair the observational footage, the documentary footage, with this score, it elevates him in what I think is quite a decent and honourable way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a good note to say thank you very much, Tom, for coming in and having this chat with us. I really enjoyed that. I hope it was an eye-opener to people listening. And I hope people go and see your documentary in any of the venues that we mentioned.
I highly recommend Losing Alaska.
And good luck with it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
I don't need to tell people here in Alaska what's happening. Thawing permafrost that threatens homes and infrastructure, faster glacier melt, rising seas, melting sea ice that contributes to some of the fastest coastal erosion in the world. And I've talked to folks whose villages are literally in danger of slipping away.
In 1 month, we lost 75 feet in 1 month.
People who stay need to be prepared to be devastated by some kind of flood. Not a safe place.
We're trying to move this village to a better, higher place.
This village is completely divided. You have two tribal councils. Families don't talk to each other.
Seems like I can use a scissor and cut the air with that.
We're being accused of not having 8 to 9 years of election when we proved them wrong. We had election all these years.
And some of the smarter ones began following the money and realizing some of the money is not accounted for.
We live in the United States, in the richest state of the Union, and this is home. It's a bureaucratic mess.
You have to tell somebody. And we need to move. I hope we'll make it. I hope we'll get together. I hope we will unite.